I should say, dear resilient final day morning panel after party, conference party people. I am happy that you made it, and I very warmly welcome you to our panel dedicated to the illicit trafficking of cultural objects. My name is Naomi Oosterman. I am an assistant professor of cultural heritage at Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands. This panel will be partially in English and in Spanish, so if you don't have a headphone, now is the time to get one. So why a panel on illicit trafficking at CIDOC and in Mexico? Well, for most of us, it is probably not that strange. Since approximately the 1960s, Latin American artifacts have been popular on international art markets. As such, specialized dealerships and auction sales were developed to meet consumer demand for these types of artifacts. However, market supply of this was and is problematic, as the majority of Latin American countries claim blanket ownership of all heritage items within their territory, some as early as the 1820s. This effectively prohibits their extraction, transfer, and export for market purposes. So without a licit supply stream, dealers and consumers of especially pre-Hispanic Latin American art turned to material that is or was looted or stolen from its country of origin, smuggled to a market country, and sold via a series of opaque market practices that serve to shield its illicit origins. This model is often referred to as source, transit, and market, or also as origin, transit, and destination. Underpinning this transnational illicit movement of cultural objects is a colonial and imperial history where source countries are those countries that are archaeologically rich and fell victim to colonization. Latin America, of course, as a region that was and is particularly rich in archaeological heritage and was particularly plundered, as the headdress or mantle pictured here, attributed to Moctezuma, is but one example. The market or destination site of illicit trafficking is located in predominantly European and North American art markets and private dealers, who are the consumers of these artifacts. The resulting ancient and historic Latin American art market is therefore saturated with over 6 decades worth of illicit material, the documentation, identification, and recovery of which is an ongoing challenge. You can imagine it is incredibly problematic to police, prevent, and fight the illicit trafficking of cultural heritage, also in contemporary times, but repatriation or the return of cultural artifacts that have been trafficked even more so. For decades, Latin American countries have made claims for the repatriation of cultural heritage, but here get lost in a web of legislation, unwillingness, post-colonial discourses, and differing motives. Now, exactly along these lines, we are going to structure our panel today. So as you can see, we are following the origin transit market model and add on to that repatriations and tools used to fight the illicit trafficking of cultural objects. First, Maria Luz Endera, Professor of Law and Cultural Heritage Management of the National University of the Center of Buenos Aires in Argentina, that's a mouthful, will start us off with a presentation about the action of huaqueo, if I pronounce that correctly, and huaqueros, so looting and looters. She will discuss this from a legal and historical framework, providing examples from the Argentine context. For transit, Marcelo Daniel Elaibe, Superintendent of the Federal Police of Argentina, will discuss tools used in the prevention and enforcement of the trafficking of cultural heritage in the Argentinian and broader Latin American region. Next up, I will speak about the European art market for antiquities and antiquities dealers' perspectives on the buying and selling of cultural heritage. Bassam Mohammed, next to me, consultant manager at PwC and PhD candidate at Aarhus University, will then talk about repatriation in the context of post-colonial cultures with a particular emphasis on Egyptian cultural heritage. Last, but definitely not least, Sophie Delapierre, the head of the Heritage Protection Department of ICOM, will talk to us about tools used in the fight against illicit trafficking from the perspective of an international non-governmental organization. Now, after every 2 presentations, we will have time for a discussion and a short Q&A with the audience. So frankly, without further ado, I want to give the floor to Maria Luz Endera, who is online with us, to start us off. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me?
Yes, and we can see your screen.
Perfect. Good morning. Thank you, Naomi. And hello to the rest of the people sharing the panel with us. Yes. Okay. Well, as you have said before, South American countries are typically places of origin of cultural objects illegally exported, and archaeological heritage is especially at risk because it is difficult to prevent clandestine excavation. Concerning the legal framework and policies implemented by the countries, I should say that in the 20th century, the protection of cultural heritage by South American countries became a matter of concern. The obligation of the state to protect cultural heritage is stated in most national constitutions, and a common characteristic of these countries is that archaeological sites and collections belong to the public domain of the state. Both countries have ratified the International Convention concerning the illegal traffic of cultural objects, such as the 1970 UNESCO Convention, the UNIDROIT Convention, and San Salvador Convention, among others. It is also common to prohibit the export of archaeological goods without the authorization of the enforcing body, and to have a sanctioning regime that includes confiscation and, in some cases, imprisonment, among others. The regulation of export certificate and the creation of committees to fight against illegal traffic have also been implemented in several countries, as well as policies for the restitution of cultural objects. I'm going to focus on the looting phenomenon and the role of different actors involved in context of cultural diversity. Previous research has shown how significant is the regional variability of this problem, as much as the way that it has evolved over time. I consider that a more holistic approach is needed to understand the social and cultural complexity of huaquerismo, looting, in order to design more efficient protection policies which would contribute to changing practices and attitudes toward heritage. Probably one of the biggest problems lies in Argentina's vast territory, in which plenty of archaeological sites are to be found, and the difficulty of patrolling frontiers. Additionally, there are coordination problems between the national and provincial administration. However, there are other complex issues which call for an anthropological approach to analyze the social and cultural context in which these trading situations arise. In Tepsin collection and trade started at the end of the 19th century. Individual institutional collectors carried out excavation, and the pieces were usually sent to top European and American museums, as well as to the newly created Argentine museums. By the 1930s, middle-class collectors, usually local residents, became more common. They were highly respected by local people who considered them benefactors who would help them in exchange for archaeological pieces. At the end of the 60s, the Argentine market expanded because other countries of the Andean region implemented more restrictive policy to export cultural objects. Looting became a full-time job for some people. However, the fear of local workers to disturb the archaeological places and tombs belonging to the Antiguos was still present. As a result of new social and legal context, traditional huaqueo tending to diminish. By the beginning of the 21st century, due to a number of reasons, such as the difficulty of obtaining valuable findings in nearby areas, the social program implemented by the government, the increasing demand for employment generated by mining activities in some regions, and recent legislation and policies implemented by national and provincial authorities, as well as security forces. Of clandestine excavation take place, such as those made by occasional collectors, the so-called hippies or craftsmen who came from big city to live to archaeological sites. They make and sell replicas based on archaeological models, sometimes obtained from their own excavation. And new actors, such as free-time detectorists and occasional dealers, connected through social network and internet, have more recently turned it into a growing and complex issue. Local people, mainly in the northwest of Argentina, appeal to counter-narrative to legitimate their own practices. From their perspective, it is only illegal the practices performed by people outside their own community and the excavation of certain things that draw the attention of archaeologists. Furthermore, when indigenous people engage in huaqueo, they often do so with a strong belief in the legitimacy of their practices, which carry spiritual and identity-building significance. To conclude, over time, the trade of cultural property has acquired different forms influenced by economic, political, and social context. In that sense, huaquero and huaquerismo
Disculpa, María Luz. Así que no sé. Yeah. Oh my God. Is it? No, it's just a brain. Yeah.
The trade of cultural property has acquired different from, influenced by economic, political, and social context. In its broad sense, huaquero and huaquerismo refers to a great diversity of people and practices of acquiring archaeological assets through illegal means, which links unequal socioeconomical context, ranging from the rural poor to the wealthy metropolitan collective. The variety of factors involved under the huaquero category needs to be considered as much as the material and symbolic interest involved. In the last few decades, government has been taking action against the illegal trade of archaeological heritage. However, there is a contrast between the law that declares this artifact as public property and the complexity of the social context in which such property is located. This issue requires a more profound reflection concerning the legitimacy of other social groups interested in archaeological heritage. Moreover, it is important to connect with new parties genuinely interested in archaeological assets and create ways to discuss and debate how to safeguard this heritage. Many thanks.
Muchas gracias, María Luz. Thank you very much. Marcelo, eres el siguiente.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Buenas tardes. Vamos a hacer una breve presentación de el traslado de los bienes culturales a partir de la brillante exposición de María Luz. Vamos a continuar con esta carrera ilegal de los delincuentes que trafican bienes culturales. Bueno, para hacer y continuar con el tema, y como lo había explicado Luz anteriormente, el primer eslabón dentro de este fenómeno que debemos conocer cómo se van encadenando los distintos eslabones. No sé si voy muy rápido para la traducción o está bien. ¿Es necesario que vaya más lento o está bien? Ok, perfecto. Bueno, entonces, el primer eslabón es el huaquero, que ya ha explicado María Luz, y tenemos que conocer el fenómeno total para poder prevenir y, por supuesto, recuperar los bienes culturales. Entonces, una vez que el huaquero se hace esos bienes, excava ilegalmente en zonas arqueológicas, paleontológicas, se los vende a un acopiador, generalmente por muy poco dinero, que el acopiador los tiene generalmente en las capitales de los estados o de las provincias, esperando que vengan los traficantes. Los traficantes eligen dentro de esos bienes cuáles son los que más le interesan y posteriormente se los llevan para colocarlos en el mercado o bien a coleccionistas ya previamente determinados. Este fenómeno se refiere a los bienes arqueológicos y paleontológicos. También este tráfico de bienes culturales se da con las obras de arte, que en este caso el primer eslabón pueden ser tanto ladrones ocasionales como ladrones profesionales. Y aquí esta distinción es muy importante porque los ladrones ocasionales, cuando entran a una casa, a un domicilio y se roban electrodomésticos, también pueden llevarse alguna obra de arte que les ha gustado, pero como no conocen del tema, rápidamente la colocan, la venden por muy poco dinero, independientemente del valor comercial que pueda tener esa obra, y entonces en ese caso es mucho más posible, más rápido recuperarla. En cambio, el ladrón profesional, sabiendo qué es lo que se lleva, generalmente lo enfría, como se dice en la jerga policial, en el lenguaje policial, lo enfría para que después de determinado tiempo pueda ofrecerlo a la venta. El segundo eslabón son los reducidores o profesionales deshonestos, sabiendo que los bienes son producto de un robo, pueden comprarlo, por supuesto, a mucho menor precio y también vendérselo a compradores, que estos también hay de dos tipos, compradores de buena fe o de mala fe. Los compradores de buena fe son aquellos que no saben la procedencia ilegal y los de mala fe sí perfectamente saben. Hoy tenemos en la Convención de UNIDROIT que se refiere específicamente a los compradores de mala fe y que para ello hay que, si uno puede ser considerado de buena fe, primero tiene que haberlo comprado por un precio de mercado, haberlo comprado en algún lugar donde habitualmente se vendan esos bienes y por supuesto y principalmente consultar una base de datos relativamente accesible. Y sobre esto vamos a volver más adelante porque hoy tenemos las bases de datos accesibles para todos. Respecto a los falsificadores es lo mismo. El primer eslabón son los creadores de la falsificación, después los distribuidores, que pueden saber perfectamente que está hablando de falsificaciones, y el tercer eslabón son los compradores, que pueden ser de buena o mala fe. En cuanto a esas herramientas y la base de datos que me he referido recientemente, nosotros en la Argentina tenemos desde el año 2002 una base de datos absolutamente pública en la cual cualquier persona puede ingresar a través de Internet y verificar alguna serie de cuestiones. Por ejemplo, está la legislación argentina, las instrucciones en el caso de robo, cuando alguna persona es damnificada de un robo, puede ver cuáles son los pasos a seguir para hacer la denuncia, imprimir los formularios o llenarlos remotamente, formularios Object ID, los cuales van a ser necesarios para pedir el secuestro de estas obras. Hay una lista de obras recuperadas y los casos significativos o los casos, digamos, que son es la base de datos propiamente dicha. Esa base de datos, donde hoy tenemos más de 5.000 pedidos de secuestro activos, hay distintos motores de búsqueda, ya sea por el autor, por la categoría, la denominación, la técnica y tipo de obra. Pero nosotros usamos generalmente el autor porque tanto los falsificadores o los ladrones justamente no quieren modificar el nombre del autor porque es lo que hace valer a la obra en sí. Entonces pueden cambiar la denominación, pueden ofrecerlo por una técnica distinta, pero el autor generalmente no se modifica, entonces recomendamos usar este motor de búsqueda. Para hacer la denuncia es necesario o hacer la denuncia en Interpol, es necesario tener 3 elementos. Uno es la denuncia policial propiamente dicha. Cuando se produce un robo, el damnificado tiene que concurrir a la comisaría y hacer la denuncia. La segunda es una fotografía. Es necesario tener una imagen porque sin esa imagen es imposible para funcionarios de frontera o de la aduana identificar solamente una obra a través de una descripción. Y por supuesto, en un formulario, el formulario que nosotros usamos, el Object ID, donde establece las características y la descripción de esa obra. Con estos 3 elementos nosotros cargamos en la base de datos nacional y por supuesto replicamos esa información a nivel internacional. Las fotografías tienen que ser de mejor calidad posible para que puedan ser usadas por los funcionarios de aduana y de frontera. La base de datos de Interpol, hoy proyecto Psique, que fue promovido por la Secretaría General, donde la Argentina ha participado desde el inicio aportando ideas y probando también el sistema. Hoy es una base de datos que es de acceso público. Hasta el 2009 era de carácter reservado, pero hoy se puede, cualquier persona lo puede usar a través de un teléfono móvil. Hay 25 categorías de objetos clasificados. Hay 134 países que han aportado información, 52.000 obras de arte cargadas en la base de datos y 165.890 más o menos consultas en el año 2020. La cantidad de consultas es bastante importante y hoy tenemos muchísimas más porque a través de la aplicación en los teléfonos móviles se puede hacer la consulta por cada ciudadano. Hoy se puede bajar a través del App Store o Google Play, se puede bajar a sus propios teléfonos, sacarle una fotografía con el mismo teléfono y en cuestión de segundos tendrá la respuesta de la Secretaría General si esa obra de arte tiene pedido de secuestro o no. Por supuesto, esto es automático, no es que hay una persona atrás para responder estos mensajes, pero es una herramienta muy, muy importante para evitar el tráfico, que nosotros acá nos estamos centrando solamente en el tráfico. En la Argentina, en los 20 años que hemos cumplido recientemente de la creación de este servicio, hemos recuperado 30.200 bienes culturales y hemos devuelto a otros países 4.800. Esto nos demuestra que aparte de la Argentina tener una gran frontera que es muchas veces muy difícil de controlar por la extensión, sí es importante que todos los países del mundo sean propensos a devolver los bienes culturales que no le pertenecen o que se están ofreciendo en el mercado sin la correspondiente documentación. Una herramienta fundamental para evitar el tráfico es no solamente que no haya oferta, sino también que no haya demanda. Por eso es necesario que los países centrales, principalmente europeos y de Estados Unidos, no adquieran estos bienes y pongan límites y controles a los bienes que circulan en el mercado nacional. Otro elemento fundamental para evitar el tráfico son los cursos, la sensibilización que hacemos no solamente a los policías o fuerzas de seguridad nacionales y provinciales, sino también a la sociedad a través de distintos cursos. Hoy con la UNESCO estamos dando un curso de carácter internacional y bilingüe para que puedan tener acceso todas aquellas personas que quieran hacerlo. Algunos casos, por ejemplo, y volviendo al tema del tráfico y traslado de estos bienes culturales, fíjense que los robos se producen en un país, se trasladan a otro y después terminan vendiéndose en un tercero. En este caso, un robo efectuado en 1983, la obra pictórica apareció en el 2018, fue robado en Santa Fe y se ofrecía $1 millón en la República Oriental del Uruguay, y que hemos identificado nosotros a los autores, pedimos la colaboración de nuestros colegas uruguayos y por supuesto lo detuvieron y recuperamos la obra de Esteban Murillo que había sido robada hacía muchísimos años. Estas son vistas fotográficas del momento de la detención de los delincuentes. Eran narcotraficantes que por supuesto se dedicaban también a colocar, porque se ve que le habían pagado el narcotráfico con una obra de arte, entonces ahora lo querían revender. Aquí está la obra cuando estaba todavía en Uruguay y aquí está la pericia donde se determinó que justamente esa obra era la que se había robado desde la provincia de Santa Fe. Hoy ya está exhibido nuevamente en el museo en Rosario. Otro caso para contar y sencillamente es de robo de monedas del Museo Histórico Nacional, donde empleados mediante el sistema de robo hormiga se robaron muchas monedas, de las cuales pudimos, esta es la vista del Museo Histórico Nacional, de este museo se robaron más de 1.000 monedas y pudimos recuperar 600. Aquí están las fotos de los acusados que los pudimos detener después de una investigación que pudimos hacer y juntamente con la colaboración de personal idóneo que nos pudo identificar las monedas que correspondían al museo. Aquí están las monedas en exhibición. Y esta es una vista fotográfica general con el jefe de la Policía Federal Argentina también presentando al equipo que en ese momento trabajó para la recuperación y, por supuesto, devolución de los bienes culturales. María Luz hablaba de las personas que buscan en el campo distintos elementos con detectores de metales, se les llaman detectoristas. Aquí pudimos detener a algunas personas que hacían esta búsqueda, por supuesto, para todos los países latinoamericanos. Los bienes culturales arqueológicos son propiedad del Estado y no se pueden vender, comprar ni trasladar sin autorización del Estado. Entonces, en este caso, esta persona saqueaba lugares y después los vendía al exterior. Este es el camino real del Alto Perú, donde con escáneres podía verificar si si había objetos metálicos en la tierra y encontraba, después los ofrecía por internet. Este es el camino real, fíjense que baja desde Perú hasta Buenos Aires, y en la provincia de Córdoba es donde hacían estas excavaciones ilegales. El detector de metales, lo vemos en la primera imagen y en la segunda, en la parte superior a la derecha, y distintos objetos que hemos recuperado. Las libretas con las anotaciones, teléfonos de personas que le compraban los bienes culturales. Y por último, el último caso que voy a mencionar, es un trabajo que hicimos en conjunto con la Brigada de Patrimonio Histórico de la Policía de España. Estos son objetos paleontológicos, 5.800 piezas estaban en España, después las pudimos repatriar, se hicieron varias conferencias por internet con nuestros colegas. Fíjense que en ese momento usábamos el barbijo obligatorio porque estábamos en plena pandemia, igual no dejamos de trabajar, y posteriormente, ya después de la pericia, volvieron a la Argentina y hoy se está trabajando con ellos. Bueno, esto es brevemente lo que quería mencionar respecto al tráfico. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Marcelo. Any questions for our first two presenters? ¿Algunas preguntas? Don't be shy. Yes, over there. Oh, well, for the microphone, otherwise.
More policing or more archaeology?
And who do you want to ask?
Everybody, anybody. I'm just generally curious.
Maria Luis, you want to try to answer? The question is, do we need more policing or more archaeology?
It's a good question. I think that the key thing is probably more policies and more dialogue between actors. And the one problem, at least in Argentina, we are the main people involved in illicit traffic in Buenos Aires City, but it's a huge country, and the looting is happening in the provinces, in huge territories, and the authorities are not so aware of the problems, or the police forces are not so trained, and there is no archaeology around. So I think this is the main issue. And the person involved with antiquities are sometimes this person who is a little bit looter, a little bit dealer, and he is the person who knew a lot, who knows a lot about archaeological heritage, according to the local people.
Yes, so again, I hear this topic of heterogeneity. That was also part of your discussion. People have different hats on. So yeah, that's fascinating. Does that answer your question? Perfect. Thank you so much, Maria Luz. Any other questions for the first two panel members? Yes, there's a question in the back.
Hi, hello. That might be maybe the next presentation, I'm not sure, but do you know what are the roads of the object being looted in South America and where they are going then after that? Are there specific roads, specific countries they are going through?
The question is, la pregunta es, las rutas de tráficos de objetos culturales. Marcelo, ¿sabes qué? ¿Cuáles las rutas normales o más común por objetos de Latinoamérica?
Sí, generalmente Buenos Aires es una ciudad de donde sale mucho bienes culturales provenientes de otros países de Sudamérica, principalmente de Perú y de Bolivia. Desde Buenos Aires se exporta a Europa, principalmente Francia, no así ahora España o Italia, porque son más, están más atentos a estas cuestiones y devuelven mucho más rápido. Francia tenemos algún problema con el tema de la fecha de ingreso, porque nos exigen probar fecha de ingreso a Europa de estos bienes culturales, arqueológicos principalmente, cosa que muchas veces es imposible. Entonces la ruta sería países sudamericanos, principalmente en Buenos Aires, y de Buenos Aires, Europa.
Muchísimas gracias. Yeah, answer your question? Did it answer your... Perfect. All right. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much to Maria Luz and to Marcelo. Muchísimas gracias. Continuamos con las otras ponencias. That's me, actually, now that I think about it. Yeah, I take full control of the market side. I am going to share screen. I think I did something wrong. No, it's there. Does it? I think it should be working now, right? And it's shared. I think it's yeah. I am totally, this is me. My time to shine. Okay, thank you all very much. It is now my turn to tell you something about the market side of things. And I will mostly be presenting research from an article that I published a while back together with Simon Mackenzie and Donna Yates, titled Regulating the Wild West, Symbolic Security Bubbles and White-Collar Crime in the Art Market. Now, as you hear, I said regulating the Wild West, and indeed a recent report by the United States Senate titled The Art Industry and the U.S. Policies That Undermine Sanctions argues that the art market in the United States is one of the largest legal, unregulated markets in the country, and is so opaque that, and I quote, buyers and sellers within this market can remain anonymous, raising the concern that corporate views are being used to manipulate markets, evade taxes, and launder money. The world of art dealing is replete with these instances of white-collar crime, including fraudulently selling copies of artworks, tax fraud and avoidance through museum donations, and dealing in looted cultural objects. Now, despite the introduction of regulatory instruments designed to prevent instances of white-collar crime via art, for example via anti-money laundering directives, the art market remains a place where crime and criminality flourish with minimal oversight. Laws and policies are often so ambiguous that actors in the art market develop their own responses to managing risks in what has been described as one of the last Wild West businesses, signifying that the art market is a relatively unregulated space. One such element that we have seen in our research is the creation of self-regulatory symbolic security bubbles, in which socially embedded, self-interested collaborations and agreements arise between actors to manage risk and take control of the security infrastructure that is lacking in this unregulated space. Authors have referred to these unregulated but access-controlled fields in geographical security bubbles as postmodern noir scenarios, in which powerful upper classes are incorporated and trusted, but those in lower classes are confined to what is called urban ghettos. We see parallels here in our research between this insider-outsider view of geographical security bubbles and our observations in our research of symbolic security bubbles. Art dealers within their symbolic security bubbles have the power to control and exclude those actors who are considered insufficiently trustworthy. The perception within the symbolic security bubble is that outside the safety of that bubble, risky transactions may result in mistakes of judgments and trading losses. The result is, at least in the imaginary, significantly better protection on the inside of the bubble than on the outside. So actors within these bubbles, and this could be art dealers, for example, prefer to rely on complex webs of insider networks, reciprocal linkages, and good faith practices rather than on external surveillance. This may sound like an exemplary case of self-policing, so a private market-based response to security that manages risks as no cost to the state, so moving from public and external intervention into the private market. But of course, there is a downside to this. The key governance challenge here is that these trust networks develop into privacy networks, which devolve over time into secrecy networks, where white-collar crime routines can remain hidden from regulatory scrutiny while being well understood and routinely practiced by those participants on the inside. So these secrecy networks may then protect participants from harm, as they were initially intended, but they also shield participants from the involvement of external regulatory, such as the watchdog. The increased state-centered government post-modern, together with the gradual replacement of traditional public police by private agents, the role of the public police art market becomes. And that is noticeable on the market side of the art market, effectively, and also on the market side of the trafficking structure. That lack of external intervention, as the following art dealer from London, not so worried about the buying of attic. I quote, like the thing. Get out of right. So what this means, what he actually says here is when he says if stolen you problem, that's legal ramification, or should be stolen, or he will most likely not be prosecuted. It was if, and most likely will be reversed by that he. So there is a bubble. They have created. I think that might be problematic. That I can't be prosecuted by it. Then a dealer in New York showed us that security are also drive out rotten apples. I am not. The entire market is a problem, but at the same time, it gives also a size of. He says there are dealers, no doubt, are very active in our rotten apple. So it is very much known that, yes, there are rotten apples that are very, very players with lack of expansion, lack of oversight within market related space. This is known within private security bubbles because it relies on privatization. Markets. So within the global illicit trafficking network, at the market side, we can our trade Wild West market, at least to draw attention to extraordinary light touch structure, where other consumer markets are regulated by quasi-government ombudsmen or other types of regulate, sometimes powers, hardly any art market. And I say art market. Despite calls for such regulation, art market in major jurisdictions prominently regulated by opt-in, generally factual by other scholars, and general matters like theft, fraud, money laundering, handling that require police. In practice, that police capacity tends to the art world and its significance. And of course, in relation to prioritization, especially when art crimes happen. We'll also talk about art crimes happen at the same time, other times. Specialized private security, theft data, phone in the or some perhaps take commercial advantage of regulatory. But they get involved in a small minority only when and the that's a little market side. And another comment that in the challenges. That treasure hunt, everyone ever goes any but to be honest, looting ancient Egyptian artifacts didn't only start with the colonial powers being in Egypt. This started during the ancient times because we already have like complete police cases, ancient police cases from ancient Egypt, telling the stories about people from the New Kingdom, for example, looting artifacts from the Old Kingdom and trying to sell them. Also because the ancient Egyptians were very keen to put a lot of artifacts inside their tombs, especially golden objects. So even during the ancient times, people started to think about the economic value of artifacts. And maybe we can also mention that in this specific case from the New Kingdom, people who were found guilty were sentenced to death because of looting artifacts. So yes, Egypt is one of the countries that has a long history, a lot of artifacts, very heavy production of artifacts, and this makes everyone like interested in having ancient Egyptian objects, especially that it's in high demand in the black market. So the most probably when someone finds something or digging to find something, then they will get a chance to sell it to a dealer or get it out of the country, and then they will become rich in 1 minute. For post-colonial cultures in general, I think the most problematic issues with repatriation are first the laws and second the politics. Regarding the laws, as I mentioned, we didn't have any control to regulate any kind of laws for the protection of antiquities. Egypt is a country that's very deep-rooted in history, but the laws for the protection of Egyptian antiquities were only regulated in 1983, which is so recent. This is because we had a long periods of colonization from different countries, and we didn't have control on how to protect our culture. So all the regulations came from the colonizing powers, and of course to serve their wishes to have everything they can take. Even if when we started to have some laws, it was like if there is a foreign expedition working in Egypt, they take the half and we take the half. And this way they take the best of everything. So let's forget about this. Currently, this doesn't happen anymore. Nothing at all is allowed to be taken out of the country. I mean, legally, of course, a lot of things happening behind. And the second point here is politics, because repatriation has a lot of politics. It's like the relationships between countries. It's not only about artifacts, because sometimes it's very political. I mean, think about the Nefertiti bust in Berlin, for example, the Rosetta Stone at the British Museum. Is this, can we consider those two cases like artifacts cases, archaeology cases, or political cases? I think this is mostly political more than anything. Just to mention that most of the photos that we see in these slides are from real artifacts that were repatriated and returned back to Egypt. And also I have to say that
repatriation is something that's happening all the time in Egypt. It's like every month we have new cases. I didn't put some examples of cases here because this session can last like for tomorrow, because we really have a lot of cases to talk about. It's all in the news, a lot of repatriation cases, a lot of smuggling cases, a lot of police arresting people at the airport, or illicit digging in everywhere. So if we are talking about documentation, of course, if there is no documentation, there is no repatriation. We have to prove that these objects were stolen, even if everyone knows that this is Egyptian, because ancient Egypt has specific style of art, so you can recognize easily that this belongs to Egypt. But we have to prove that it was stolen. So it's not like the responsibility of the museum who hosts the object to prove from where they got it, even if they admit that it has no provenance. But we are the country that, or the organization that has to prove that the artifacts were looted. And we can't do this if we don't have proper documentation. And I have to say that with all the high numbers of artifacts in Egypt, it's really, really difficult to document everything. Also, this relates to new discoveries all the time, and illicit digging, because illicit digging means that we don't have any information about objects. Maybe we have some info about this site, that this site was looted, but what exactly they could take from the site, we don't know, because they just take it from under the ground and sell it somewhere, and we don't see it. So sometimes we can recognize the state of art, or the period when these kind of objects were made. So we can recognize the site or the kind of objects, but we don't have exact information of objects coming from illicit digging. And also, if we are talking about documentation, we cannot deny what's happening on the internet, because Facebook, YouTube, Telegram, eBay, and a lot of social media and e-marketing websites are now black markets for selling looted artifacts. And it's really easy to find artifacts. If someone is interested in buying something, it's very easy to find them. Especially, for example, for taking Facebook as one example. Just try to maybe write something like ancient Egyptian artifacts for sale or something like this. You'll find a lot of pages and groups on Facebook dedicated for selling looted artifacts from Egypt. Some of them are actually private groups or restricted groups. This means that they work behind all the eyes. No one can see them. You cannot see whatever they are doing inside the group unless you are invited to be part of it. New objects, like newly discovered, they sometimes put it on a Facebook story. So if like the police or the archaeologist didn't track this in the same day, we will lose everything and every information about this object forever, because Facebook stories only last for 24 hours. The internet is a large market for all of this, but also we cannot have any control on this. This is because most of those platforms are coming from the USA, and according to the laws of the US, they are not responsible for any posts or comments coming from the users. So we cannot actually address Facebook or YouTube for hosting those kind of posts or videos, because they are not responsible for this. So currently there are some projects working on illicit trafficking on the internet, and what they are doing, like for example, I know that there is a project which is called ATHAR, ATHAR. So what they do is to monitor the internet, to document what they can find, to create some kind of reports on this, and if there is one case that we can work on, then they can contact the authorities and start to repatriate. Also, there was a project at the British Museum. It was called Circulating Artifacts, and they were also monitoring every Egyptian object on the black market on the internet. Maybe we also need to talk about the roles and responsibilities of the authorities. Yes, we all know that there are some international agreements like the UNESCO Convention 1970, but in real cases, those kind of agreements or conventions are treated like supported documents. But it's not an obligation for someone or some museums or countries to return objects back to the countries where they belong. Also internally, let's say in Egypt, we have a dedicated police for tourism and antiquities. We have at the Ministry of Antiquity, we have the Department for Repatriation, Department for Seizures, this work inside Egypt, and also Department of, I'm not sure about this word in English. This is when the police takes something back. They put it for a while until the case is done. So in a country like Egypt, because we have a lot of cases like this, we have several departments, and also the police of internet, they work on cases on the internet. But for some other countries, I think maybe organizing the responsibilities inside the country is something very important, because we cannot only work on repatriation and we ignore what's happening inside. We have to control it from inside first. Of course, this kind of work needs capacity building, because there has to be a lot of specialities. I mean, people who are working with laws and regulations, archaeologists, documentalists. This is because working on repatriation is exactly like police cases for a crime. So you have to do a lot of investigations, and it's a long period until the crime is solved and you can get back the artifacts. Yes, of course, we also need technologies to do this, and the cooperation with other countries, other organizations. These are very important points in capacity building for repatriation. And the last thing I want to mention here is the very importance of connecting the people with antiquities, connecting the people with archaeology, connecting the people with cultural properties, because this is how they get the awareness about the case. This is how they protect their own heritage, because in most of the countries, the looters are locals, and they feel or appreciate the economic value of antiquities more than any other thing. And talking to those people and letting them feel other kind of values will be very important to stop the looting chain from inside before it goes outside. Also the connection with management, because I've seen in many cases that people don't really get connected or engaged to archaeology because they see that the management is not good enough. So one of the important things is that the management of antiquities or archaeology in every country start to work directly with the people, to tell them that we are working together on this. We are not like in separate islands. I think those are most of the challenges we face in repatriation. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Wesam for your very enlightening presentation. In the interest of time, we are going to move right ahead with Sophie. So whenever you're ready, Sophie, you're up.
Thank you. Do you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you perfect.
Super. I will try to... How do I do that? Always forget. It's... this one. So you see my screen, right?
I can see your screen, but not yet on the big screen.
Okay.
Yeah. So give us a sec. Yeah, now we are there. However, Sophie, we can see your notes, but if you don't think that that's a problem, then I would say we can just.
I have no notes, so it's okay.
Perfect. Then
The next slide is not the notes.
okay.
Mm.
Okay, perfect. Okay, go ahead, Sophie.
So sorry, I'm not so. Thank you for the invitation to speak a few minutes, and also thank you also to the technician for helping me with this presentation. So in a few minutes, I have been requested to do this short presentation on the very specific thematic, which is the museum community and particularly ICOM's role in fighting the illicit trafficking of cultural goods, and that's what I will try to do. So the first question that I've been asked is why museum and one ICOM is working on this fight against illicit trafficking. And I remember earlier in the conversation, you spoke about people having different hats. It's exactly that for museums, because we have several hats. Contrary to our partner like UNESCO or Interpol, who have their own mandate, but us, we can be at the same time victim of theft. We can be also the expert next to the police, next to the customs, to advise them about, especially on the fake one, because illicit trafficking is also the problematic of fakes. And so we can be very reliable then, and very, very important for them to advise on an object under investigation. And also we acquire. So we are an actor on the circulation of objects, and specifically on this question, it is very important to know that even now this question is quite high on political agenda. For ICOM members, it's a problematic that have been raised at the very first General Assembly of the organization in 1947. It seems strange and it seems archiving or historic things. But for me, it's an important slide because it shows that for the very beginning, this organization saw that this question of illegal excavation and exportation was a problem for museum world. And so since then, it's not the point today to do all the how ICOM has dealt with this topic and the instruments they have dealt from the beginning, and also the code of ethics, etc. So I will just give you a glimpse of the tools that have been developed, and then of course you can dig if you are interested. So generally when I do a conference, I always present this slide because they are currently the four tools that we are mainly using when we are invited on, when we do trainings or when we do awareness raising. It's the object ID. We heard previously from the representative of Interpol. It's true that in the new ID Art app, Interpol and ICOM has been discussed this question about using the object ID administered by ICOM within the app, because it's just a norm. It's a norm of description of a standard, and I'm sure CIDOC knows that better than I. So it's about documentation in a very, very, very easy way that can be used by anybody who needs to describe an object. And this is a perfect tool, even if it's quite old, from the 90s, still today it's very, very used. So we continue to do training on that. Sometimes we give module of 2 hours only on object ID. Code of ethics is another one. There are several articles that are dedicated to the valid title, the provenance, the documentation. So the fact that an organization such as ICOM, a professional organization, has standard higher than legislation generally, it's very also important, and it's the proof that we can work on this level better. Then there's the red list that I will speak a few minutes now, and then it's the newest one, which is the ICOM International Observatory. I will not have time today to go there, but it's an instrument that we have from the 2015, fundraise for 3 years, and then since then, like surviving, but we are nearly there to do the phase 2, and I would be very happy to launch the phase 2 if we succeed to have the funding I expect, because it is a platform when you can find thousands of resources. The database needs to be improved, but it's also a platform of experts who meet twice a year from everywhere in the world to discuss topics related to illicit trafficking on all the areas. It can be underwater question, or it can be new legislation, it can be export certificates. So it's a very place to brainstorm a lot. So I really hope that we will be able to launch phase 2. So now back on the tools that I would like to speak to you. 3 minutes. It's, well, the well-known red list, which are maybe one of the most known tool of ICOM related to the heritage protection. Here is like the history of the red list. The most recent one that made with my team is the regional one for Southeast Europe. Then the emergency one we made for Ukraine. Then the last that we launched is Brazil, with the specificity that we focused on topics that were maybe not so inside before, such as fossils, because yes, the traffic of fossils is quite higher than before and more present. And we are currently preparing the one for Greece, and the others are under preparation for next year, and possibility of update too that are currently under examination. So red list for who to do what globally. Well, they are made of, we'll explain a little bit later, it's where there are sometimes a misunderstanding. They are not stolen objects, but objects that with a group of persons, generally museum people, have been designated like very vulnerable. And why we do that? Because, well, I could do in history, but it's too long. But the fact that we say we have databases, that's fantastic for police for sure. But to be in a database, it means that the object have been seen stolen, and it's the object have been inventory and photographed. What about all the looting on the archaeological sites? What can we do with that? Well, the red list is exactly that, is to say, this object you see in the red list is not stolen, but if you see something looking like that, well, careful, red flag, because we tell you 3 things. We tell you that it's in very vulnerability in this country. We tell you that it's in very high demand on the market, and we tell you that it's protected by the country. So if you see, as a policeman or a custom officer, an object going like this, circulating without documentation, or that, well, be super attentive, because it's probably a difficulty, so needs investigation. That's all red list does. So it's only one tool among many other tools, but a tool that has its own place. We'll always speak about police, about customs, of course, but it's also for anybody involved in the circulation of objects. So we also give to auction house, we also speak to it about museum, because they also acquire. So that's really a global tool that's free, that's online, that is translated. So, well, we try our best to make them known as much as possible. So one of the last one, and as you ask me to focus also on that, it's about object. Yes, true. But in the red list, it's not only about showing object, it's also showing 2 other very important information. First, you can find at the beginning of the red list the contact of national authority. Like that, if you have question, if you need to contact them extremely quickly, you can. And then you have also generally a page about national legislation, bilateral agreement, international instrument and ratification, which are really also important. We try also to put them in a very easy format, because sometimes the law, especially, is to be super long and, well, super complicated. We just say the type of regulation, the number, the title, and the date. Then after, as a person who investigates, you have enough to begin your research, for example, going on the UNESCO database on national legislation, for example. So that's always like the red list is always this step to let you go further, in your investigation, let you go further in the contact, let you go further in the legislation, because it must stay a simple object. Then, well, because I knew some people on the panel and the nationality, I tried to dig a little bit in my archive, and it's true, it's a very, very old example from the police in Argentina, if I'm not mistaken, is to show you how it is used. In fact, as you can see on the left, you have some bronze bells and some Buddha heads. And then it's from the, well, a country in Latin America, maybe our colleague here from Interpol can confirm. But it have been an operation, 2008, I think so. And they used the red list, apparently, to recognize objects. Then, of course, the investigation was gone, and probably the red list forget. But at least it made its job at the time, just to recognize, say, oh, that look like the same. Let's stop it. Let's red flag it, because it might have a problem. So just to show how it can work, I have a more recent example of this kind of use, but I wanted especially to take this one to make me a little bit relevant because of the country involved. And that was with the red list of China. And then, well, I just spoke about Interpol, so it's only fair that we say that ICOM on the fight against illicit traffic at international level, because of course there is a fight at national level, and that is very important, that may be the most important. Our work is mainly to keep us together, working in our own mandate, but together with UNESCO and UNIDROIT. We heard already about the two conventions, 1970 and 1995 convention, that we push for ratification because it's on these strong pillars, strong legal pillars, that we can build red list. I just say an example. Imagine that an object has been seized, the people investigate, and then it's time for restitution. It's really, really complicated when you don't have legal basis to restitute. So all our work is for nothing. We need strong legislation. And we heard the Professor Andere speaking about legislation. That's the main point. And for us, we can do operational tools, but they have to find roots in legislation. So then we also work, of course, with Interpol and the World Customs Organization for training, for exchange of information, for general help together. And voila. And of course, also ministries, universities, other NGOs, etc. But those are our main international partners. And then there is a moment, of course, where there are tools that ICOM can do at international level, and we do. We do trainings. We do, for example, currently we are doing trainings in Burkina Faso, Mali. We just finished Côte d'Ivoire. When we speak about illicit trafficking, we always say that, of course, you can help the police. Of course, you can help the customs. Of course, you can help your ministry. But the first thing you have to do, your first duty as museum professional, is your inventory. So I explain them that when you inventory, when you document, you fight traffic. And that has to be understood, because the lack of inventories today is still a very, very problematic point that ICOM is really, really fighting as much as we can. We have to find the resources to help to do them. We have to find the resources to do proper storage and museum documentation and museum inventory. So of course, generally in my presentation, I show object ID, I explain the basics of the basics. But of course, the work done by CDOC in general, I mean, in all these higher aspects, very technological to these most simple tools too, it's very fundamental for us. And in every time we explain to our members that, of course, there are things that we say at very minimal level, but there are a world of instruments, of tools that exist within CDOC, and we really encourage to reach you, to reach all the resources that you put online, as well as the work of your working group. So what I said, I would like to finish to say, when our work finish at international level, CDOCs begin, or the opposite if you want. I'm okay with both sides. But it's important that we are joining our efforts on this very huge question of fighting illicit traffic. And clearly, museum people have a big role to play in fighting in fighting this terrible problem of traffic. Thank you for your attention. I hope I was not too long, and I'm eager to question, if any. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I think your presentation also brought really nicely together all the different aspects that we already heard this morning. So that was really, really great to see how e-com is also present in every part of the trafficking chain almost. We have some time for questions. Please don't be shy. You can ask them to any of the panel members. We're all open for you now. Yeah. And with a few minutes, I mean 3. But we have some time for questions. Why don't I try to start this off? I'm not so shy. I have a question for my fellow physical panel member. I love that you were talking about how in Egypt you have a problem with laws and a problem with government. So you were talking about politics. And effectively at one moment you were talking about the politics of repatriation in relation to, for example, the Rosetta Stone and the Nefertiti bust. And I couldn't help but wonder if there was also not some sort of almost performativity of repatriation. It extends beyond the object itself, and it enters into a bigger political playing field or playground. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on what the politics of repatriation means in relation to well, either the objects that you mentioned or in the general sense of the Egyptian case.
Yes, let's start from what you mentioned at the end, the general sense, because something like this has never been announced.
Yeah.
So it's not like Egypt is not working on the Rosetta Stone or Nefertiti bust because it's political, but yeah, everyone can understand that it's somehow political, because also at that time we didn't have proper documentation. We were colonized. So sometimes, yes, you don't have the full proof for something, but some other time you feel that it's political, so much political. Especially that, as I said minutes ago, that almost every country has Egyptian objects. So are we going to get into trouble with the entire world for this?
Yeah.
So sometimes when it's, you have the evidence and you have the means and you have the tools to repatriate, it goes very smoothly. For example, if I'm saying that maybe the Rosetta Stone is political somehow, does it mean that we don't repatriate objects from the UK? Of course, it happens all the time. And also in many times, museums and even private institutions, they contact Egypt and they tell them that we find something in our storerooms and we think that we don't have like proof that we have the right to keep it. So you can get it back. So I can say that political affairs in these matters are not announced, but you can feel it in the air.
Yeah, no. That's why I was asking. That's Thank you so much. Any other question from the audience?
I have one just in case.
Yes, Maria Luz. Go for it.
I would like to ask Sophie more details about the red list in Latin America and the Caribbean. Is there any current or near future agenda you are working with these countries in right now or in the near future?
Yes, thank you for the question. We have already a few for by heart. I don't know all of them, but we have Central America and Mexico. We have Peru. We just made Brazil. I hope I don't forget one because they will not forgive me. Yes, and we have other countries that are currently asking or an update or a new one. So yes, it's well, the proof is today, but also when you attend the meeting in UNESCO, yes, Latin America is extremely active and understandably. So it's really reflecting in the red list that we are doing, that one part of them is from this part of the world. So it's currently we have some already, 4 maybe, and updating the route on the way, and new, yes. But we need also to find the team of experts. We have to, it's all a system, because we need them to do quickly, of course. People think that is maybe not quick enough, but if we want to do a qualitative work, it takes a little bit of time, and then we need to translate and we need to disseminate them, because when we finish one and publish one, we made 50% of the job. The other 50% is to distribute, to make them known, to train with the police and the customs. So yes, but believe me, Latin America is very high level priorities, such as Arab countries, such as Africa. So yes, we are trying to be as balanced as possible, but we have an eye on the traffic, on the reports that we spoke about. I saw the representative of Egypt speak about Athar, for example. Athar met all a report, of course, but there is all part of the report that they use the red list object. So you see that it's kind of everywhere tool that people use in their own practical aspect, which is perfect. But to arrive to do such tool, we need to be very, very careful. And we have one of Egypt. I'm sorry, I should have put the one for Egypt too. Of course, we have one for Egypt. So yes, it's always like ongoing process. But as I said, very active part of the world for obvious reason. I hope I answered your question.
And yes, it was in Argentina where the police used the red list made about China.
Okay.
Yeah, and Marcelo can give you full details because he was the head of the operation.
Oh, I didn't know. Oh, fantastic.
Yes. Bueno, esta operación fue muy fructífera porque pudimos recuperar no solamente objetos pertenecientes, en breve lo estaremos devolviendo. Justamente la semana que viene viene un ministro de China para retirar las piezas, sino también objetos de Egipto, que está en discusión si esos objetos, algunos no son originales, pero la mayoría sí, y los tenemos acá en nuestro depósito, así que con mucho gusto podría acercárselo a la expositora que hablaba por el tema de Egipto. Y recuperamos también bienes de otros países, arqueología argentina y arqueología de Perú. Y llamativamente, estaban atrás de una falsa biblioteca que se corría, tenía unas rueditas abajo, se podía empujar, correr, y atrás había una puerta que permitía ingresar a una sala donde tenían exhibición todos estos elementos. Parece de película, pero es la realidad. Y gracias a que los oficiales que estaban en la calle, preparados por ICOM, pudieron reconocer los objetos que estaban en exhibición. Eran los únicos objetos en exhibición, que eran esas campanas y la cabeza que ha mostrado Sophie. Y eso fue el puntapié inicial, fue el inicio de la investigación que llegó a un término excelente.
Well, I don't speak Spanish, but I think I understood most of what you say. Congratulations, because it's quite impressive. All the slides you show about what you were able to see during investigation. So it's very impressive. And sorry, I will just use this opportunity because generally I beg during my conferences that when people have example of how they use the red list to like you for investigation, or a professor during a module, of course. So anytime you use the red list, do not hesitate to tell us, because like that we can also nourish our own database of example. Database is a big word because I don't have so many examples, because unfortunately it's really rare that we come to us and you said, oh, I used the red list and that was, well, good or criticism. So do not hesitate to tell us if you use it in another way. And I was checking in the same time, of course, I forgot one. We also have one for Colombia. Like that, I name all for America. Sorry for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcelo and Sophie. I think the fact that policemen recognized these artifacts on the street is a wonderful, wonderful example of how these tools can really work. We have unfortunately come to the end of this panel. I am entirely excited with this. I could be talking about this for another, for 20 years. I want to thank really with all my heart my fellow panel members, both online and offline, for taking the time. We are a truly international panel in a truly international time zones. So Sophie, thank you so much for being here. It is very late, I know that, but also to Maria Luz y muchísimas gracias, Marcelo, and of course to Wissam. And I want to thank you very much for being here in the morning. I wish you a very best rest of the conference. And if you have any questions for us individually, or if you want to email, I'm now speaking for every one of us. Please feel free to reach out via email or tap us on the shoulder here. All right. Thank you very much and have a lovely time.